Great. Welcome to HEDG Hosts, a series of events run by the Historical Economics and Development Group at the University of Southern Denmark, where we invite some of the most incisive writers and thinkers inside and outside academia to present their work and demonstrate the relevance and continued impact of historical developments on contemporary societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Emeritus Leandro Prados from Universidad Carlos III, Madrid. Leandro is an economic historian who, during his long and distinguished career, has published on many topics, including the development of Spain and Latin America, and freedom and well-being in a historical perspective. We're looking forward to hearing his talk today on human development and the path to freedom. And then a quick practical note, as I was saying to Leandro just before the talk started, you cannot ask questions during the talk. What you can do is afterwards use the question and answer function in Zoom and write your questions there, and then I'll read them to Leandro. Over to you, Leandro.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I'm very grateful for the invitation to the Historical Economics and Development Group, and to you, Paul, especially. My talk is about a book published last year, and the topic is well-being beyond GDP. So the idea is that there is a consensus that well-being is a multidimensional phenomenon. And so my purpose here, accepting that view, is to look at history and to look at especially to the last 150 years of globalization and economic growth, and to look at well-being from a not linear perspective, not just focusing on income, which is an important facet, but it's just one facet, but on a wider approach. So let me refer to a classical economist, a new classical economist, I would say, Amartya Sen, who 40 years ago, roughly 40 years ago, wrote a very challenging article in which he distinguished three types of approaches to well-being. On the one hand, he said, there is the opulence approach, which is basically command over resources, but you could identify this approach with income and wealth studies. It's interesting to consider the paradox that despite unsatisfaction with the use of GDP as a measure of well-being, most economists continue to rely on GDP as a measure of well-being. And this is basically, this is grounded on two points, I would say. One is what Jones and Klenov in their classical 2016 paper claim, that GDP per person provides an informative indicator of welfare. But there is also this idea, but other economists such as Alton, who thinks that at the end of the day, non-monetary dimensions of well-being are highly correlated with GDP. So, but if you go, you widen the approach, you would see that the OECD in their house life reports, and particularly Van Sanden in his, Jan Lotten Van Sanden in his house life to volumes, they offer an alternative dashboard approach in which they consider material conditions, quality of life, and sustainability. But at the end of their approach, they accept that the multidimensional well-being is useful for ex-post assessments of economic development. So basically, they assume that you can add more dimensions, but at the end of the day, all dimensions of well-being are highly correlated with GDP per head. There is another approach which is more ambitious, which is what Sen calls utility approach. And following Pigou, he distinguished between satisfaction, which is what we would nowadays identify with subjective well-being, in which happiness and life satisfaction are the two main components, and welfare in a broad sense that weights non-monetary dimensions of quality of life. For instance, the John and Klenov paper I mentioned, or Daniel Gallardo's paper, in which they compute a consumption equivalent welfare index that combines consumption, leisure, inequality, and mortality in a utility function. And then there is the most ambitious of the three approaches, which is what Sen calls freedom, but freedom in a positive sense. Freedom to, in this case, freedom to live well. This is grounded on a sense capability approach in which well-being would be depending not only on the life people lead, what he calls achievements, but also on their capabilities. In other words, the freedom to choose between alternative functionings, or the freedom to choose their own life. So in my presentation today, I'm going to, and this is what the approach I'm following, using in my book, I'm going to use this capabilities approach, at least in its reduction version, which is human development. So the main capability tenet, which is enlarging people's choices, is the main purpose of human development. So the main elements for enlarging people's choices, according to the human development approach, are three: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and enjoying a full life. But obviously, this is theory, but moving from theory to measurement, and particularly to measurement for the long run, implies a lot of compromises. So you have to accept indicators or proxies. For instance, the proxy for a healthy and long life would be life expectancy at birth. The proxy for access to knowledge would be years of schooling. And in the case, but at least these two elements have the virtue of being measurements of achievement in the sense of measuring a health condition or an educational level, and also can be considered a measure of capability in the sense of avoiding ignorance or avoiding premature death. But how to proxy mastering resources to enjoy a full life? So the shortcut is per capita income. But obviously, per capita income is not a capability, it's an input that can be turned into a capability in the sense that income per capita allows people to live a full life, but you don't really need to be a millionaire. So that's why it entered with diminishing returns. But things, problems, or challenges don't stop here. The next challenge is how to measure dimensions. You know, when economists or economic historians look at one dimension, for instance, life expectancy, they use original values. That happens with life expectancy, it happens with heights in the anthropometric literature. But here we need to homogenize. And obviously, one solution would be a kind of linear homogenization, considering a denominator, which is the upper and lower bounds, and then looking at the ratio between the distance of the actual level of an indicator and a minimal level compared to this range between the maximum and the minimum. But this is problematic for a very simple reason, is that social dimensions tend, such as life expectancy, heights, years of schooling, literacy, tend to be bounded. What do I mean by that? I mean that being bounded in the case of life expectancy means that in no country life expectancy at birth goes beyond 85, and in no country is below 20. So it's not comparable. And the same happens with education. You don't have 100 years of schooling or 1,000, unlike the explosive nature of per capita income. So you need to do something. Let me give you an example. If you take, for instance, life expectancy, and you compare two countries, one country, a poor country, in which life expectancy is 30 years, and that improves their health conditions and jumps to 40. So there is a 10-year increase. And you consider a developed country in which life expectancy jumps from 70 to 80. In absolute terms, it's the same improvement, 10 years. But in relative terms, in the second case, the improvement is much lower. Just using the conventional human development index, you would realize that in the first case, the increase is 100. There is 100% improvement because you move from 0.15 to 0.31. And in the second case, the improvement is only of 20%. So this tends to shrink the distribution across countries, and also usually implies a kind of spurious convergence. So the news tend to be too good to be true. And then there is another, to me, even more important, which is the fact that, as I said before, we're moving from highly abstract concepts, such as access to knowledge, to very crude indicators, such as years of schooling. So these proxies are not adjusted for quality. So adjusting for quality also matters. And just let me give you an example. If for the post-1990 period, fortunately, we have information about what is called healthy life expectancy, which is a summary measure of health computed with age-specific death rates and with years lived in disability per person. But this only exists from the mid-1980s. But you can do a panel, as I'm presenting here, in which on the vertical axis, I'm presenting healthy life expectancy years of, and in the horizontal axis, life expectancy at birth. And you can see that there is a very close correlation between the two. And this captures the fact that as life expectancy increases, the disability declines for each age cohort. So that's why healthy life expectancy, or the quality of life, rises. This is not news. This is just an empirical confirmation of Free's hypothesis of the compression of morbidity, which basically says that morbidity may increase in absolute terms, but it experiences a relative compression. So the proportion of years in disability decline as life expectancy goes up. Just to finish this part, let me just give you an example. Before, just at the end of the 20th century, in sub-Saharan Africa, life expectancy at birth was about 50. Out of those 50 years, 15%, 15%, were lived in severe disability. At the same time, in OECD countries, life expectancy at birth was 77 years, and only 8% were living in disability. To go a step further, if you do the same kind of comparison between quality-adjusted years of schooling in this figure and the raw years of schooling, just quantity years of schooling, in which quality-adjusted take into account not only years of schooling, but cognitive skills, you also find this association. So in other words, the bottom line is more years of life expectancy at birth, or more years of schooling, represent also better health and better education in childhood and in youth, because, as I said before, the improvement in quality of life is across the board, affects all age cohorts. So let me then finish with this section with one comment, is that the conclusion is that you cannot use linear transformation. You need a convex transformation, in the sense that now social variables, for social variables, identical changes in absolute terms represent larger achievements when they are obtained at a higher level. So it's a convex transformation, unlike the concave transformation you obtain with a linear transformation. So let me show how life expectancy, the population weighted average across countries, looks like over the last 50 years, 150 years. This is how life expectancy at birth looks. You can see there is sustained improvement over time, but for two episodes. One is as in the late 50s, which is associated to China's great leap forward consequences on death rates. As you know, this provoked a great famine and millions of people dead. And the second one at the very top here is COVID. And also you can notice that between the late 1920s and 1970, this line is steeper. So that means that acceleration takes place in these central years in the 20th century. If you replicate the exercise for schooling, you can see that there is a sustained improvement, but there is an acceleration after 1950. But let me just make a remark here. You remember in the definition of human development, there are two elements. One is what you achieve in terms of schooling, in terms of life expectancy, so in terms of health, in terms of knowledge. But it's also important the possibility of choosing between different options. In other words, to choose the kind of life you want to lead. And unfortunately, agency and freedom are missing in the practical measurement of human development, in the conventional human development index. Freedom to choose just is not there. And this is important. Why? Because if you look at the ranking, you can see that countries in which freedom has been seriously curtailed or plainly suppressed rank high in terms of human development. And this is odd, and this is at odds with the concept of human development. Just to give you a personal example, when the human development was introduced, in 1990, they produced a sort of historical retrospect going back to 1975. And then obviously at the time, I went immediately to look where my country, Spain, ranked in 1975. And it ranked very highly. Well, 1975, you young people probably know, or maybe not, was the last year in which we were under dictatorship by a ruler called General Franco. So obviously there had been achievements, maybe despite the dictatorship, but certainly there was no freedom to choose the kind of life you wanted to have. So that was a bit surprising for me. In fact, from a capabilities point of view, what matters for well-being is not simply your achievements in terms of health, knowledge, or a decent living standard, but the freedom to choose. And this is something that was already stated in the third Human Development Report in 1992. As you can see here, the purpose of human development is to increase people's range of choices. If this is not the case, it becomes a mockery. So, in fact, we could go a step further, since you're in an advanced country. You could say that you could have a high level of human development according to the United Nations Index, because you would enjoy access to knowledge, you would have very good medical treatment, and you would be properly fed, and you would also have a decent standard of living in a high security prison in Denmark. But I don't think this is what you would choose if you had the option. So unless you allow for agency and freedom in the Human Development Index, the index is a mockery, as a Human Development Report in 1992. So, but just to finish this first part of the presentation, this is not news. In fact, more than 150 years ago, a couple of individuals wrote the following: in the present epoch, the domination of material relations over individuals and the suppression of individuality has assumed its sharpest and most individual form, setting existing individuals a very definite task, replacing the domination of circumstances and of chance over individuals by the domination of individuals over chance and circumstances, which is basically what human development is about. But the surprise is that the authors were Marx and Engels in the German ideology. But 100 years later, assessing the progress achieved by advanced economies such as England, another author wrote, the most significant and far-reaching effect of this success is the new sense of power over their own fate. They believe in the unbounded possibilities of improving their own law. And this author was a different one, Friedrich Hayek in the Road to Serfdom. So let me show you the empirical results. If there is the possibility nowadays of including freedom, not only positive freedom as Sen wanted, freedom to participate in a political process, what we would call electoral democracy, that means political liberties, is a collective positive liberty because it involves competition in elections, participation, and accountability of those elected. But you can combine this with negative freedom, freedom from coercion, freedom from interference. And this is a negative freedom that stresses individual rights, minority rights, civil liberties, checks and balances, etc. And this is what the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index covers. So you can see that there has been an improvement over time, but there was two major backlashes from the late in 1920s, and then after World War II, particularly from 60s and 70s, and most recently after 2010. But over time, there is an improvement in civil and political liberties at the level multiplied by 4. Okay, so with all these elements, we can compute a human development index in which, to begin with, we face a dilemma. As you know, and probably most of you don't like composite indices. You prefer individual indices, or what the OECD call a dashboard, or the World Bank. A dashboard has the advantage of ranking countries using different criteria, but has the downside that country ranks wouldn't be consistent over time. In favor of the composite index is that here we would use a composite index for a latent variable. A latent variable is a variable that is not directly observable, has to be inferred from others. So the composite index would imply that the sum of the variables is more informative than all each variable considered individually. But Sen, quoting his friend Mahbub ul Haq, has written, the goal the HDI had was to compete with GDP using another number, which was, in his view, as vulgar as GDP, but contained more information. We can discuss later on issues such as the marginal rate of substitution between components, but I will leave that for the debate. So to finish the presentation of the index and to go to the results, let me just summarize what we have here. We have social dimensions transformed with a convex achievement function. Liberal democracy, as it allows for not only quantity, but also quality changes, is just use the conventional linear transformation. Per capita income is accepted to enter at a declining rate in the absence of a better proxy, and all of them are combined with an equally weighted geometric average. The geometric average advantage is that you reduce the susceptibility between components. So you cannot increase one in order to offset for another. If some of them falls dramatically, the index falls dramatically as well. So this is how the human development looks. This is a population-weighted average for the whole world, and this goes from 1870 to 2020. You can see I have circled 4 episodes: the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 50s, the oil shocks of the 70s, and the COVID at the top. And you can see that only after 2015, the average human development in the world, according to my own depiction, has declined. Also matters to say that human development over until 2015 had multiplied by 5.3, and that there is a rather steady growth. This is explained by the fact that most components are stock, not flow variables. This is something that some people are shocked or surprised, but using stock variables smooths the evolution over time. But it's important to note that the period 1913, 1950, and 1950, 1970, so is the interwar, or the period between World War I and World War II and its aftermath, and the Golden Age are those periods of faster improvement in this augmented human development index. Now, what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation, because I have to talk about the numbers, I'm going to, in order to narrow down the focus, I'm going to consider how well-being defined in this multidimensional framework compares to per capita income, not only in terms of average trends, but also in terms of distribution. So firstly, how does human development, augmented human development, compare to average income? In this case, I have suppressed the log of per capita income. So is the augmented human development index star is all components except per capita income. You can see over here that the 2 of them, per capita income is in continue red line, and and the blue one is augmented human development excluding income. You can see that over the long run, they look very much alike. Although if you look closer to these central decades in the 20th century, you will realize that the curves have a different slope. So, but in the end, per capita income grows at 1.5% cumulative over time, and augmented human development star grows at 1.3. So would you say that does this imply that their trends concur? This is important in order to throw light on current controversies. I remember about 10 years ago, Bhagwati and Sen exchange different views in the New York Times about the extent to which we should give priority to economic growth as everything else in terms of well-being will come along or not. So this is important, but let me just show you something that doesn't that makes things less simple. If instead of looking at the long picture, we look at distinctive phases over time, and I'm going to consider growth rates here, you can see that the growth of augmented human development and per capita income, if you consider the whole period, at the right-hand side of this diagram, you can see that they basically grow, as I said, at similar rates. Per capita income a bit faster. But if you look at different periods, the first globalization prior to 1913, well, still they are similar. And if you look at the last 3 decades of the 20th century, 1970 to 2000, again, you find the same. But what happens in the first part of the 20th century? That human development doubles practically the growth rate of per capita income. And the opposite happens in the golden age, or not to mention what has happened in the last 20 years, in which, in both cases, the golden age and the last 20 years, per capita income has improved much more intensively than human development. So why is that? Why aren't GDP per head and human development trends correlated? And what I'm going to try to do here is to compare what happens to each dimension and per capita income. Firstly, in terms of trends, and secondly, in terms of distribution. So let me start by plotting pairs of values for life expectancy, which is here represented by this index on the vertical axis, and the log of per capita income on the horizontal axis. It's in log, so, but if you want to translate it into Gary Kami's $1990, the range is between roughly $300 and $3,600. So you can see that this is what most economies would expect, that you move along human, would represent a sort of health function. In what you can see is that as per capita income grows, health improves. In other words, there will be movements along the function. And this makes sense because if you are richer, your nutrition is going to improve. And if your nutrition improves, that strengthens your immune system and reduces morbidity. And also, if you're richer, you probably are going to have a better public provision of health, maternal care, clean water, etc. However, what happens if we compare this cross-section for 1820 with another cross-section, let's say before World War I? And here there are some interesting results. We just replicate the same association, but for a different period. And we can see, particularly after $1,000 of per capita income, that for the same income levels, health is higher, life expectancy is higher. So what we observe here is not just movements along a function, but upward shifts in the function. Why there is this upward shift that implies that at the same income level, people are healthier? This has to do with advances in medical knowledge, both what you would say embodied and disembodied medical technology, both in terms of not only new medicines, but also in prevention of bad health. And why is that? Well, this is related to something called the epidemiological or first health transition, in which there were gains in terms of lower mortality and higher survival rates as infectious disease gave way to chronic disease as the main cause of death. And this is the result of the diffusion of the germ theory of disease from the 1880s. I remind you that in opposition to the idea of miasma, that is to say, vaporous exhalation causing illnesses, now germs, pathogenic agents, bacterium, virus, cause illness and its transmission. So this is a major change in medical knowledge that has a practical translation in terms of prevention of diffusion of infectious disease and increasing and reducing the importance of infectious disease in death rates. So this happens way before penicillin, as you can imagine. So there are new medical technologies, such as vaccines from the 1890s, but it's also prevention. Let's look at something that, in my view, is particularly interesting, which is, let's look at to another cross-section, the cross-section for 1950, and which is this yellow line. And you can see that there is a major upward shift. And this is, I would say, a counterintuitive result. What is the conventional wisdom? For instance, presented by Acemoglu and Johnson in the classical Journal of Political Economy paper in 2007, is that global health improvements only took place across the board after World War II. And this was when new drugs from the West were disseminated through the world, thanks to the work of international institutions. But we find this upward shift before 1950. Why is that? It is true that there are medical new technologies, as I said, vaccines, there are sulfa drugs from the late 1930s, but antibiotics only existed in the late 40s, early 50s, and they were prohibited for most people. I mean, you can recall, for those of you who like movies, The Third Man, Orson Welles movie, in which penicillin is a major object of illegal activities in the black market in Vienna. So what would be the explanation? The explanation is that it's not just the germ theory of disease not only facilitates the emergence of new drugs, but also stimulates prevention, because it stimulates low-cost improvements in public health. And as I said, the diffusion of preventing measures to disease transmission that had an impact on infant mortality reduction and maternal death reduction, that, as you know, are the main elements behind improvements in life expectancy in developing countries. And this explains why this improvement takes place across the board, in both countries of low purchasing power, but also in countries under colonial rule. So this happens in India. This happens in colonial sub-Saharan Africa. This happens in Jamaica, as Jim Riley has studied. And this happened in 1940s Spain, when standards of living in terms of per capita income had gone back to 1920. But it was these low-cost improvements in public health and this diffusion of preventing methods. And let me just finish this part on life expectancy, showing that if you just compare to another cross-section in 1970, which is the green line, you can see that here, although in the 1960s, new independent countries had, and most countries in the developing world had very active governmental policies, and there were new chemicals such as DDT in battling malaria, but the diffusion of the epidemiological transition was largely exhausted. So in this case, per capita income grew as fast as, after a certain level of income, as fast as improvements in health, only in the poorer countries below, say, $3,500, the improvement took place in life expectancy. And so this is, again, counterintuitive. And finally, I would like to show you what happens when we move to the present. And the blue line represents 2000, the cross-section for 2000, and the red one for 2020. And you can see that here there is another upward shift. And how come this has happened? And this is due to a new health transition in which so far, like the first epidemiological transition, it has been restricted to advanced countries, in which basically what has happened is that mortality and morbidity has fallen among the elderly due to new medical knowledge spread, such as a better treatment of respiratory and cardiovascular disease and vision problems. And this all obviously has been helped by better nutrition in the early years. So, but this is so far restricted to a part of the development world, or is more intense in the advanced country, to be more precise. So, what is the bottom line of this series of slides is that there has been better health at any income level over the last 150 years. So this changes, it's not the improvement in health has been more than proportional to the improvement in income. So if we replicate the exercise, and I will speed up here, for education, we find that up to 1950, they evolve along the function. In fact, if you look at 1970, you realize that after a certain level of per capita income improved faster than schooling. And this simultaneous improvement in per capita income and in schooling is explained by the fact that schooling, mostly public, was stimulated by new social visions, for instance, nation building in the new independent countries, the spread of a common language, centralization, and of course, industrialization, urbanization. And something also important, dissemination of Western values and elite values. And you could say on the downside that war and conflict also help, because war required indoctrination and compulsory military service. What happens if you move to the end of the 20th century? You have good news, because there was an important improvement, an upward shift, which is related to citizenship, to probably to improvement in political representation, and also the emphasis on human development and redistribution. As you can see, again, in the case of education, as time goes by, there is higher access to knowledge at any income level. And lastly, what happens when we consider political and civil liberties? This is interesting, because in political civil liberties, there is a popular view postulated by Lipset in the late 50s, which is the theory of political modernization, that claims that economic development brings democracy, liberties with it. And Carlos Bosch qualified a few years ago this proposition, saying that in fact there are changes or shifts, or he was actually suggesting outward shifts over time in the relationship, and also that the relationship exhibited diminishing returns to income. In fact, what I observe is increasing returns to income, because you can see there is a convex line here, but it could be a downward shift. And in fact, you can see the blue line is 1870, is the cross-section for 1870, and the other two are, the orange one is for 1913, and the yellow one is for 1950. And you can see that civil and political liberties have improved at a slower pace than per capita income for quite a while. Because unlike what most political scientists do, which is looking country by country, if you take into account international developments, there are two important issues to consider. One is the decisive role of great powers in shaping international order and interfering with domestic policies of different nations, and also is the dissemination of ideas, either liberalism or authoritarian ideologies. And if you can see here the green line for the cross section for 1970, you can see that there was a downward shift because this is a phase in which authoritarian regimes, both right-wing and left-wing and populist, spread across the globe. The good news is that if you look at what happens in 2000, the diffusion of human rights ideas and liberalism and the decline of socialism across the globe allows this outward shift. But the last 20 years have represented a backlash, and there is the red line, as you see, is below the blue one for most income levels. And this is associated to the rise of illiberal democracy and populism. But over the long run, you can still claim that at least for up to the end of the 20th century, but I would say over the long run, there is a freer world at any income level over time. If you just look at human development, which is a combination of these three variables, you can see that there is some movements along the function, and these movements shift downwards in the 70s, but improve at the end of the 20th century, and have improved not much ever since in 2020. So this means that, as I said before, that the two main takeaways from here. One is that this approach does not ignore the importance of growth, but evidences that different levels of human development can be achieved at the same level of income. And that another bottom line is that in terms of well-being, multidimensional well-being measured by the Augmented Index of Human Development, well-being has improved for the same income levels over the last 150 years. So now, I don't know, Paul, how much time do I have, but if you indulge me a few more minutes, I would like to look at the distribution. I will skip this figure here and we'll go straight away to the following question. To what extent the picture I have provided so far, which is an optimistic, relatively optimistic picture, is representative? Because as we saw in the case of life expectancy, improvements have been unevenly distributed in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and now with a new century. So the question is, are these trends representative? This is the distribution of human development in the world in 1870, and you can see that the darker zones have higher human development levels. And if you replicate the same figure for 2015, which is the peak in terms of human development, you can see that this uneven distribution remains. So there are a few questions that I will address very quickly. The first one is, well-being inequality higher today than it was 150 years ago? The second question is how inequality of different dimensions of well-being compare? And looking closer, which parts of the distribution have obtained the larger relative gains? And lastly, how does it compare, this well-being inequality compares to per capita income inequality that we know thanks to the work of Bourguignon, Morrison, and Milanovic, among others. So let me show you what happens to life expectancy inequality. Let me remind you two things. One, I'm going to look at relative inequality, which is what people associate to inequality, in which inequality depends on country ratios to the international mean. So that means, as you know, that if the level of human development changes proportionally across the board, there wouldn't be changes in inequality. The second thing is that I'm not using the conventional Gini, I'm using the MLD, or mean logarithm deviation, which is a measure sensitive to transfer at the lower part of the distribution. And finally, this is what Milanovic would call inequality 2. So it's not global inequality. Inequality among world citizens is population-weighted inequality across countries. You could say that this is a lower bound, according to empirical studies, is a lower bound of global inequality, but trends probably are similar. So this, in the case of life expectancy, you can see that there was an increase of inequality up to the mid-1920s. And this is associated to the fact I mentioned before that the diffusion of the germ theory of disease was uneven because only countries that were more advanced and that had the human and physical and financial capital to afford it enjoyed. Then there is this dramatic decline from the late 1920s to the early 1980s, these 60 years of decline, which is the result of the progressive international diffusion of the epidemiological transition. And this is particularly intense in the 1930s and 40s. This blip here is the effects of China's mortality during the Great Leap Forward, this blip here in 1960. But it's important to notice that. And then there is a slowdown from the 1970s, which is related to the exhaustion of the epidemiological transition. And then you can see that it flattens after the 1980s. And this is related not only to the impact of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa or to the demands of socialism in Central and Eastern Europe, but to this other second health transition I mentioned, limited to so far or mostly to the West and affects elderly people. So there is, to some extent, a parallelism between this flattening of, or this stop of the decline in life expectancy inequality at the turn of the century with the one that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century. But if we now look, and this is using what is called the growth incidence curve, which is instead of looking to averages, such as the Gini or the MLD, thus, we look at what happens to every percentile, in this case, to every ventile of the distribution, the country distribution in the world. And you have on the horizontal, on the vertical axis, the growth rate, on the horizontal axis, the different ventiles. On your left-hand side, the lowest levels of life expectancy in 1870, and on your right-hand side, the highest level. And this is the improvement over 1870-2015. So that tells you what is it's a summary result. So you can see that it's the 45th to 60th percentiles, those who obtain the largest gain. And then, so you would say the middle class of the world, and then is the lower middle class, if you like, above ventile 20, percentile 20 to 25. And those at the top are those who benefit less from this relative improvement. So this is consistent with the decline in inequality. What happens if you broaden the comparison to include now not only life expectancy, but civil liberties and education? If we now compare relative international inequality, remember the blue line is life expectancy, the dotted red line is schooling. You can see that in the case of schooling, there's a steady decline from 1892 to 2000. And if you look at the improvement by ventiles, you can see that while in the case of life expectancy is the middle percentiles, those that improve more, in the case of education is the bottom, the one that experienced a larger gain, those below percentile 25th. And then we can also look at what happens if we add civil and political liberties. And here the picture is quite different, because as you can see, there was an improvement in the late 19th century, but there was a systematic decline between 1890 and World War I. But after that, there is a sustained improvement in inequality because different things happen, the diffusion of liberal ideas, but also the diffusion of authoritarian creeds. It's only after 1970 when you have a decline, and this decline takes you back to more or less the early 1920s. So if we now just finish looking at the relative growth incidence curve, you can see that in the case of civil liberties, the improvement is widely spread across what you would say the middle class in a broad sense, between percentile 25th and percentile 75th. So what happens now if we summarize and go to see human development? Well, in the case of human development, you can see that there has been a decline in relative inequality from the late 1920s to 2015. In terms of distribution, those in the middle class and in the bottom, at the bottom of the wealth distribution, those ventiles have improved much faster. So this is quite reinforcing of the first part of the presentation. The results I have presented can be considered representative, and the improvement I have shown in terms of well-being is representative of what happens in the world. So to close the presentation, let me just do two things. One is to compare to per capita income. And you can see that if we compare to per capita income, which is now a per capita income relative inequality is the continuous red line, they reach, the two lines cross around 1930 with the same level of inequality, but they follow opposite trends, a declining trend from the late 1920s in the case of human development, a rising trend up to the late 20th century, and there is only a decline from the 1990s. If you compare what happens to different ventiles of the distribution, you can see that it's not only the middle class in the case of the dashed red line, the middle percentiles, those which improve, but also those on the right-hand side of the diagram, those are at the bottom. Let me just, in order to not to have such a always optimistic view, let me just finish by showing what happens if we, instead of thinking in terms of in terms of relative inequality, we widen the scopes and look at absolute inequality. As you know, there are people who prefer to say, well, relative gains are fine, you know, if our income increases 10% for across the board, inequality doesn't change. But there are people who think, well, what matters is absolute inequality, which is what is the distance? Because if my income is 100 and your income is 1,000, well, a 10% increase in my case is 10, in your case is 100. So it makes a substantial difference. So if we compare absolute inequality now in dotted line here in red with relative inequality, we can see that in the case of absolute inequality, there is a sustained improvement over time up to 1960, and there is only a decline after that. And what matters most, if you look at the distribution by rentiles, you can see that in terms of absolute gains, the absolute gains go to the top 10% of the distribution, whereas in terms of relative gains, those goes to the middle percentile. So to conclude, there are some points I would like to make. Firstly, augmented human development has expanded worldwide, especially in the central decades, 1920, 1970, but the room for improvement is significant. The secondly, that there is an apparent development puzzle that the trends in multidimensional well-being and per capita income not always match. And this can be exemplified in the case that during the globalization backlash, when per capita income stagnated or fall, there were improvements in human development. Then something which is important is that the relationship between well-being and per capita income doesn't only move along a function, but also there are shifts in this function. In our case, we can say that these upward shifts represent that there have been higher well-being levels at any per capita income level over the long run. And finally, augmented human development has been unevenly distributed. In the case of multidimensional well-being, the decline in inequality started in the late 1920s, unlike the case of per capita income, where the decline only takes place after 1990. And also it's important to stress that the middle and low well-being incomes achieved the larger relative gains, but the larger absolute gains went to the top. So what are the challenges ahead? There are three challenges I would like to stress. One is we need to increase mobility compression. This is particularly important in sub-Saharan Africa, and I can tell you why, but not now because we have run out of time. Another challenge is to improve the quality of education, even though in broad terms, the improvements in quality and in quantity are correlated, but they're part of the world, such as Latin America, where quality of life of education is lagging behind improvements in quantity. And then what is more, in my view, the most worrying element is the threat to civil and political liberties than populism and illiberal democracy tendencies are implying today. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Leandro. That was a